Welcome back to Brass Tactics. Sorry we're a little bit late this week. It's the first week of classes here where we work, where we do our day jobs that actually pay us money for talking about things. But anyways, this is going to be the first installment of our long vaunted discussion of the Kursk Offensive, the latest and greatest development of the Russia-Ukraine war.
Not the one from 1943, the one from 2024.
All right, well, getting into the meat and potatoes of today, Pete, by the way, we now have a fan base currently located at the United States Army Sergeant Major's Academy.
Oh, great. We're going interstate now. This is really exciting.
Where we have received positive feedback and endorsement from one Sergeant Major John Belt-Fed Bleep Machine Bandy.
That nickname kind of makes him sound like a professional wrestler.
He's going to be really, really tickled that you said that.
I would be terrified if I saw him on the other side of the octagon.
No, if you heard him, you'd be terrified. He's got one of them silky chocolate command voices.
Oh, wonderful! That's good. That's good. Thank you so much. We're always glad to have new people listening. Besides, my immediate family and the people that Joe pays for the reviews on Spotify.
Yeah, that's true. Which are mostly my immediate family. So anyways, going back to this few episodes back, we discussed Mouse or Moose Muss, whatever you want to call it, the principles of war. One of the most important principles, arguably, is maneuver. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, there hasn't been a whole lot of units maneuvering in the last 2 years of this war, give or take. And the Institute of the Study of War, actually, somewhat ironically, I'd say, Pete, well, less than a week ago, released a report proposing how to restore maneuver to the battlefield. And one of the things that they pointed to is that this extremely lethal combination of long-range fires and longer-range unmanned reconnaissance platforms is just a really nasty combination. And that's something we've talked a lot before. And so for this first installment of talking about this Kursk offensive, I just wanted to bring that up in front. And then I know you follow the tactics a lot more closely than I do, Pete, so I was going to hand it off to you. Sort of recap what we've been seeing for has it been 2-3 weeks now? Gosh, we are so far behind the times with getting this podcast out.
Well, I mean, not really, because things have stalled out, per se. The initial... All right, so we'll dial it back. So about 3 weeks ago, the Ukrainians crossed into Kursk Oblast, or province, which is on the northern eastern side of Ukraine and not part of the active front line, which currently kind of runs down through east of Kharkov through the Donbass region over to Crimea. The timing is a bit unusual. It's a little late in the year to start an offensive like this. This was after Ukrainians have sat on the defensive for about a year before this. Their last offensive operation before this was back in June of 2023, when the so-called Freedom of Russia Legion, which is a group of Russian deserters, expats, and other anti-Putinists, launched a kind of a raid into Belgorod, which is to the southeast of Kursk. That was much smaller scale and only went a few kilometers deep before it was thrown out by the Russians. This is a different type of animal. It's a multi-brigade attack. It was very carefully planned for in complete secrecy, even from the Ukrainians themselves. Apparently, Ukrainian regimental and battalion commanders only found out 3 days before, and the line troops found out day of, or the day before. So it was planned and executed in complete secrecy, probably also from the U.S. as well. It's not like the Ukrainians to then spread the news what they're going to be doing before they execute it. And
well,
it was also
they did with the last counteroffensive. I mean, that was trumpeted pretty solidly, and I feel like they learned some valuable lesson there.
I absolutely, and I would agree on that. Especially also, again, the direction of it. This area that they attacked into, they're taking into Russian territory now, and it appears to not have been, A, held by the highest quality troops. Apparently it was mostly conscripts, and B, not as nearly well fortified as the areas around Belgorod, and then also further to the south towards Mariupol and kind of the southern axis of advance towards Crimea. Secondly, not only was the attack planned and executed in pretty good secrecy, the Ukrainians also timed their attack within apparently a metric ton electromagnetic jamming and first-person view drones. So they were able to apparently jam, this is according to Russian sources, by the way, on Telegram. The Ukrainians were able to jam the Russian UAVs, which then kind of cut off their frontline troops and then swarmed them while they were cut off in their defensive positions with first-person drones with explosive payloads. That then allowed small Ukrainian teams to infiltrate through, stormtrooper-style tactics, actually, kind of an homage to World War I. And also the way that the Russians are getting success on the Donbass axis, kind of in the same way. Jam, isolate the defenders, and then swarm them with small shock troops, which for the Russians, they tend to use more expendable troops for that because they have lots more of them. For the Ukrainians, they can't really kind of do that same level of attack. Anyways, the initial attack is apparently very successful, relatively. All right, this is all relative. This is a vast front, and they're able to seize 20 to 30 kilometers up northeast toward Kursk, and they've kind of stopped moving north, and now they appear to be consolidating west toward a river. I think it's the Sumy River, and basically trying to cut off the Russians in kind of a small hook. When you zoom out, this offensive is not terribly impressive. All right, we're talking 30, 40 kilometers penetration, a few thousand Russian POWs apparently that I've seen pictures of, and probably a few more thousand
That's
killed or
not an
wounded.
insignificant gain in and of itself, though.
It's not an insignificant gain, but it's not a knockout blow. The real unique thing about this is, and my personal belief why the Ukrainians launched it at this time, was that prior to this, there was some talk from Putin as well as, my goodness, Peskov, I think the Russian foreign minister, about a ceasefire that would freeze the front lines in their current spot. At the time when they were saying that, the front lines were all entirely in Ukraine. Now the Ukrainians have reached in and bitten off a chunk, not a huge chunk, but a chunk that contains a good-sized village inside Russia. So the talk of ceasefire and freezing the line has now stopped from the Russian perspective because they can't exactly do that. So I think it's actually given the Ukrainians a good amount of decent leverage. Additionally, after a year or so of sitting on the defensive and just kind of getting pounded and attriting the Russians down as best they can with the Western equipment, they have shown, the Ukrainians, I believe, needed to demonstrate that they're doing something proactively as well, taking the fight to the Russians, trying to bring the war to a conclusion faster rather than just trying the attrition thing, and demonstrate resolve not just to the Europeans, but also the Americans, especially with the presidential election coming up. A lot of what's happening right now, all around the world right now, whether in Gaza and Ukraine, even in the South China Sea, the whole world is kind of globally posturing for the U.S. presidential election and trying to influence its outcome.
Yeah,
I'd say that's pretty much the long and the short of it. It's not a feint. It's a serious offensive. It's a serious attack. There's tens of thousands of men committed on both sides. But is this going to force the Russians to pull vast numbers of brigades from the Donbass up here? I don't think so. I think they'll just stuff more conscripts into the gap and then hope the Ukrainians will lose the edge. And then the Russians will be like, you can see there doesn't seem to be any panic in Moscow. Either they don't think the situation's dire, or Putin just is being lied to by his subordinates. Both are entirely possible, and maybe a mixture of them. But they probably figure the Ukrainians will tire themselves out in the attack. It's a vast distance. They're not going to get to Kursk city. They're not going to get to the Kursk nuclear power plant. And we'll just blow them up with artillery as they overextend the supply lines. Then we'll just grind them back slowly.
Have we seen any Russian response from the main battle line? Have they had to shift anything
There's been no evidence of that. No, they've pulled troops from apparently Moscow, St. Petersburg, and also Kaliningrad. But I don't think they've shifted troops from the main Donbass axis of attack, where they're still achieving some limited success along the central axis heading west.
Some of the things that I found, well, honestly, the biggest surprise to this was that I would have expected just a probe when this counteroffensive first kicked off, right? Like a quick hit in and out, wham bam, and then retreat. But like you said, they are clearly holding ground.
Yes.
And you said now they're holding ground near a river.
Yes, the Shame River. I'm probably butchering it. The Sejm River.
Yeah,
River. Near the town of Sumy.
Is that a traversable river?
No. Actually, that's one of the things that I think is kind of centering the Ukrainian hook. There were 5 bridges over it, including a pontoon bridge. Right now, there's just one pontoon bridge left. The Ukrainians have hit all the others with HIMARS or glide bombs. So they're obviously hoping to trap what's left of the Russian garrison south of that river and kind of hook across. And then once they've gotten that, they've actually gotten themselves into a better defensible position. It's a pretty good-sized river, about 25, 30 meters across and too deep to walk or drive.
So Colonel Sullivan over at the Modern War Institute, I don't know if you read that recent article.
No, actually, I haven't. Although you did name drop it on LinkedIn, and I got the notification for it. So I really should start paying attention to these things.
Yeah, I mean, it's the best strategic take that I've seen so far, honestly. So he calls it a wedge and hedge, right?
Yep.
So hedging, as in hedging their bets, along the lines of what you were talking about with peace, ceasefire negotiations, freezing, armistices, etc. Or worst case scenario, now they own a piece of Russia that they can potentially essentially ransom back in order to regain at least some of the Donbass if it comes down to peace negotiations.
Yeah, it's clever. I don't think it's I think it's a better use of their military force. I would agree on both counts. I think it's totally both. And I also think it's a very clever use of their military force, which is limited, and much better use than smashing themselves futilely against the Suvorikhin line, right? That southern triple 4-stack defense in depth that the Russians have built across southern Ukraine at this point. And yeah, or other things that would just be folly, like attacking across the Dnipro River, for example, into like across from Kherson in the south. That would be absolute bloodbath because they don't have the engineering to support it or the potential for air superiority. Speaking of air superiority, apparently that was another thing that has assisted their attack is they have been using the new F-16s that they've received. They've been using pretty much all their air assets that are still able and kind of suck them up to the front to at least get a local air superiority for the attack, which has enabled them to reach out, bite, and now hold. And like I said, as this conflict is showing, once you've gotten the territory, it becomes really hard to extract you from it just because of that, the lack of complete and total air superiority on both sides. Because once that kind of localized superiority is achieved and you've grabbed a chunk of territory, now you move in the air defense systems and they can create the little bubble of kind of the no-go zone to prevent others from getting back in there.
We're going to save a little bit of this air defense talk for installment 2, which we're going to record in this same session.
There's also a trade-off because obviously since both sides have been locked in an attritional fight for the last year, over a year and a half, it's obvious that for things to change like this and to open up a new theater, you are diverting needed forces and reserves from other places. So we do not know if the Ukrainians have weakened their reserves or defenses in other places in order to achieve this breakthrough and kind of this chunk grab. And we also don't know the Russians now, right? Because the Ukrainians have seized the initiative. The Russians now have to make a choice. Are they going to be able to lie to their population long enough and basically convince them that everything is fine? And I think there's over 150,000 refugees now from Kursk Oblast that are now flooding into Moscow and the other cities that have been evicted because either the Ukrainians are in their homes or they're so close to the battle line that they cannot be there. So you now have hundreds of thousands of refugees that are being pushed out into the interior of Russia. And can you keep that secret long enough? Can you basically convince the people that, oh yeah, no, everything's fine. There's no issues here. And that it will not worry people on the home front. Probably shouldn't be a problem for the Russians to maintain that control. But the longer the Ukrainians stay there, the harder it's going to be to get them out. And are the Russians willing to accept that and allow the Ukrainians to fortify themselves and dig in order to maintain their offensive in the Donbass, even at such a rate that they're going? They're going to have to make that choice. I'm willing to bet, just because how slow the Russians seem to be moving, that I don't think they have the capacity to throw the Ukrainians out that easily. It just doesn't look like it.
Yeah, this is definitely a gamble on the Ukrainians' part, right? And that's where the wedge portion of this wedge and hedge strategy comes in, because they've physically created a wedge into Russia, arguably for narrative purposes, potentially as a staging point to elsewhere, although I'm just not familiar enough with the region of where you would be staging to. If you look at
Yeah.
if you look at it on the zoomed out map, one could plausibly believe that it's setting up for some sort of envelopment or turning maneuver onto the main battle line. But it's still
No, yeah, it'd be
pretty significantly removed from, like, distance-wise, it's pretty far north and west.
yeah. I would counter against those kinds of people that draw those massive blue arrows on the maps. Like that's a turning maneuver from Kursk all the way toward the Donbass that's five, six
Tele
hundred
telegraph
kilometers.
really, really far off. You're
Yeah,
gonna
they
give them
would. Yeah,
a lot of time. Is it a staging point to just make a desperate assault directly towards Moscow?
oh, no, no. I mean, that's the worst thing you can do. Remember, I think von Manstein said, "The vastness of Russia devours you." Right? You don't do desperate thrusts toward
Yeah, I think it was
Moscow.
Napoleon that said that was a terrible idea.
Yes. Insert quotes here, and I'm sure some Pole said something as well back in the 1640s with more colorful language. But you don't do desperate thrusts.
Fazzini said it too.
It
Vizzini. Never get
start a
in a
land
land war
war
war in
in
Asia.
Asia. Yeah,
Yeah,
there you go. And don't make a bet with a Sicilian when death is on the line, right?
yeah.
So you don't make the Ukrainians. This is not a desperate gamble. This is not a battle of the bulge. Okay, this is a very I wouldn't even
So
hesitate calling
I'm
it
glad you
a
brought
freaking
that up
gamble.
because I keep wanting to draw that comparison there, but something just doesn't smell right with it.
No. So the Battle of the Bulge, that was a wedge and a hedge, actually, an attempt but for
Right,
Hitler to do a wedge.
same
But
strategic premise.
yes, but the balance of forces, not even close, right? When you really think of it. And
Well, the Germans just didn't have the capacity to contest air superiority at that point either.
well, also the German intent wasn't to try to grab it and hold on for a bargaining. Well, actually, they were actually trying to grab and hold on for a bargaining chip. Technically, they were hoping they could split the British and they were hoping they could split the Western Allies from the Soviets, which obviously we know now in hindsight that was never going to happen. It's a nice thought, I'm sure, in December 1944. You get okay. So look at the Ukrainian lines. Okay, so it's not like the Bulge. The Ukrainians are breaking out, and if you look at like the map of Ukraine, it bends north away from where they're attacking. So if they're hooking left, they're actually just going to link up with their own border and move their whole border forward about 50 or so kilometers. It's a salient at the moment. They're trying to close it and form a pocket. It's not that they're reaching out toward a singular objective that we know of. If they had, like some people had thought, driven straight for the Kursk nuclear power plant with an attempt to either shut it down or melt it down, which I did read a couple articles about during the first 2 or 3 days of the offensive when they had no idea what the objectives were, maybe that would be a bit more, because that would be a big stretch and they'd be really, really pushing out their lines. Remember,
I
like,
feel like they would lose all international support if they did something like
no,
that.
that's a risk that they don't think is worth taking, apparently, or
Yeah.
they can't do it.
So
Also, you
there's
have to
no way the US would sign on to create another Chernobyl
yes, and also don't forget the style of the
right
whole
next to
attack is
Chernobyl.
the style of this attack is completely different because uh, Joachim Peiper, the German commander in charge of basically the spearhead of the Bulge, with his task force, he was only given enough fuel for a one-way trip. Like he knew that if they didn't capture Allied fuel dumps on the way in, they were absolutely done. By the time they got in, I think it was 4 or 5 days into the attack, they had a nice cloud cover, which allowed them to keep away from American close air support. But then the clouds start clearing, the King's Tigers start running out of gas, and the entire offensive peters out before they're able to actually achieve what they need. And they have to abandon their King Tigers and basically retreat eastward. This is a completely different kind of thing. The aim is limited. Ukrainians have jumped out, staying within their own air defense bubble, bitten off a chunk, and they're already digging in. And now they're kind of consolidating. That's what I think, and that's
Are
what we're
they just
seeing right now.
moving the line of trenches forward wherever they can?
Yeah, that's what it appears to be. They're turning the town of oh man, there's a good sized town in the middle of the salient, and the name is escaping me, but they're turning it into a fortress right now.
So if we apply Occam's razor here, so we eliminate the most unlikely and most improbables and impossibles, and then all that you have left would be the probable. It seems like this is mainly a hedging of a bet.
Yeah, and
What this is.
Suza is the name of the town, and that's the one that they're using as their king piece.
So the court of international opinion can't really force or compel Ukraine to sign an armistice anymore, because before Russia would have just signed on to, yeah, let's just freeze the lines where they are, right?
Right.
But now Russia can't agree to that without losing considerable face, since they would be ceding Russian sovereign soil in the event that they signed on to something like that.
Right. It's a town of about 5,000 people. It's the administrative center of the county. And like I said, this is sitting on places where tens of thousands of Russians consider home, with another 100,000 adjacent being forced out as refugees because they're now within the battle zone. So it's a clever trick, definitely a clever trick. And here's the fun thing too, which I like to point out for people who are like, oh, the Ukrainians have no agency. This definitely would have been against the advice of Americans, because the Americans don't want to escalate, right?
No, the Americans have been very clear that they are not comfortable with most of their weapons being used outside of Ukrainian territory, which is a really, really significant handicap, especially when you link it back to that concept of maneuver, right?
Right, because the Russians can maneuver behind their own line in Russia.
Exactly.
Previously, this was before the Kharkov offensive that the Russians tried a few months ago, which failed. But the Ukrainians have essentially now called Americans bluff, as well as the French and the Germans and the British. And they're like, well, guess what? We need to use these now because the front line has now moved. And guess what? The weapons supplies have not stopped. And what's more important, you know what? The Russians haven't nuked us yet, right? All these red lines that Putin has been saying, can't do this, can't do this, can't do this. Again, another red line's been crossed, and the bluff has been called, which is, again, it's reckless, but so far it appears to have been paid off.
Yeah, I mean, they got to keep towing, because previously they were Ukraine, you are fish in barrel, there's limited room to maneuver. It's really easy to pick you off, even though you have these really cool toys. And so now they're going to keep towing the line. And at some point, there will be nuke, or there may not be nuke. But I'm willing to bet that if there is nuke, Russia will not deploy a nuke in the middle of an offensive that's happening inside of their sovereign soil.
There you go. That's another way to push it. Speaking of hedging, but I mean, to be honest, I would be most concerned about the city of Lviv. If the Russians are ever going to use one of those, it will be against Western Ukraine, and it will probably be the city of Lviv, because the Russians, they don't consider that a Russian city. They consider that a Polish city, and they also see that as kind of the tumor, right? The malignancy. This is the heart of the cancer that's kind of turned Ukraine away from being Russian and thinking of themselves as Russian.
But then again, to use a nuke way outside of the scopes of where the war is active, or where the war is hottest and the point of greatest contention, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's going to do a little bit more than raise some eyebrows in the international community.
Right. It does change things. But what are they going to do, right? Sanction Russia more? It's the thing I'm wondering about, like, what more can be done?
I guess we'll see. Nobody's used a nuke since the last time it was used. And everybody was like, hey, that was pretty bad. Let's not do this one again.
Yep.
So I guess time will tell.
Mm-hmm.
So
that phrase so much, because it's all we hear now. That's all we've been saying for the last 2.5 years, man.
So if we're right about this, what can we expect to see in the next 3 months? A lot more of nothing again?
No, I think the Ukrainians are continuing. Well, they are continuing to push. I think.
Yeah, but so it sounds like they're creating like a buy and hold strategy. They're just carving out a new piece of new Ukraine, and they're planning on holding that so that nobody can force an armistice, because neither Russia nor Ukraine would agree to the status quo.
Right. I think they'll also continue attacking where the Russians appear weak now. Because also, you have to think, now that they've opened this can of worms, there's a whole nother 1,000 kilometers of Russian border on Ukraine that has not been touched yet, right?
Where else do we not have frontline troops on the front line?
And so they can now, this was pretty darn successful. Now you can start being like, hey, regiment commanders, start taking some initiative. there's only, you figure there's only a battalion of Russian conscripts over there. See what you can do. Take a bite out of them and try to change the calculus in our favor some more.
Well, I mean, but the air defense assets are still in fairly high demand, though.
Yeah,
but
correct.
you'd still say that we're gonna expect to see a significant amount of probing and most of the initiative lying with the Ukrainians for now?
I believe so, until Rasputitsa starts in about a month and a half. So they have until, I'd say, mid-October, and then the rains will start again, and then the roads it will be so muddy that they won't be able to move effectively again, just like in the springtime. It's just like clockwork. It's how it is on the Eastern Front. You can only maneuver for about 5 or so months in the summertime, and then not even actually, well, like 4.5, but in between May and September through there. Then the rains come, the roads disappear, then the snows come, and you have to wait till it freezes.
All right. Well,
The way it is.
we should write this. We should start like a betting pool. I mean, that seems a little bit macabre.
That is
But,
extremely morbid. That's like straight in a cabin in the woods.
Keep a tracker of some of the predictions we have to see if we're actually worth a penny or two as analysts.
Yeah, well, like I said, the Ukrainians are playing hard because, and the Russians are too. Have you seen any of this Russian propaganda coverage of the Democratic National Convention?
I have not. What's it been saying?
Oh, it's astonishing. All they're bemoaning the fact that like Kamala Harris is up in the polls more, and that Trump has shot himself in the foot, reducing himself to personal insults, and they're just like fretting all about the election and making it very obvious who they want to win. They'll tell you up and down they want Donald Trump to win for all sorts of reasons. But they're covering it like wall to wall.
That's wild.
Oh, well, are you surprised though? Right?
No.
Because now, and they know full well we're watching that. And again, it's that classic freaking Russian move, right? Because they're playing to the foreign audience and the domestic audience. What better way to do it than just poison the well and to openly, state your candidate's preference? So, and the Ukrainians are playing this game too. The Ukrainians they're hedging their bets because whoever wins in November, the Ukrainians still need to demonstrate their utility and that they need, A, deserve a seat at the table, and B, if you're going to keep the aid coming, we're going to keep using it. So I think you'll actually see an increase in pressure all the way up until November 2nd, and then you'll see a sudden decrease after the election's over.
Honestly, I mean, so we don't really endorse or try to stay into too much politics one way or another. But part of there's a big assumption here that I'm interested to see if it holds true or not is, if the Republicans win, does the aid flow stop? Does the aid flow even shrink? I don't mean to sound too skeptical when I ask, how many politicians do you recall actually doing something that they said they were going to do?
Well, they can't until January 20th anyways.
As
right?
We all know / don't know, but secretly know, the CIA always gets a vote in our foreign policy as well.
So again, it's not going to immediately turn off in November. It might not turn off in January. We don't know, even like whoever wins.
Well, as soon as the announcement is made, though, Russia's just going to plan accordingly, right?
Yeah.
Just sit back and wait.
Yes, correct. But we don't know. We don't know how much of the campaign posturing is just talk. We don't know how much of it is actually policy until it's actually implemented. But the thing is, the fears of what those policies could do has a chilling effect.
And on that note, I think we'll end it here. Hey, please tell your friends about us. Please tell your classmates. Please tell your colleagues. Please tell the random stranger that had the misfortune of sitting next to you at the bus station.
Yeah. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends.
And if you don't enjoy this podcast, tell your enemies about us.
Share and enjoy.
Yeah. Give us a like. Please subscribe or follow, depending on if you're an Apple user or not. And let us know if there's anything you want us to cover. Anything that we could cover, or anything that you want us to do better.